The rain wasn't just falling, it was colonizing the windshield. Awife gripped the steering wheel of her aging hatchback, her knuckles white against the plastic. It was nearly 2 a.m., and the stretch of road between Cork and her cottage in West Cork felt less like a highway and more like a descent into the mouth of a hungry animal. "Nearly there," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing against the rhythmic thwack-thwack of the wipers. The GPS was a glowing wound on the dashboard, its blue line cutting through a sea of digital black. Then came the detour. A fallen branch, or perhaps a flooded dip in the road. The sign was hand-painted and jagged. Diversion. She followed the narrow lane, the hedges on either side pressing so close they clawed at her side mirrors. The trees overarched the road, forming a skeletal cathedral that blotted out what little moonlight survived the clouds. And then she saw it. The tunnel. It wasn't on any map. It was a concrete throat, stained with decades of weeping moss and calcified minerals. It looked like an old railway passage converted for cars, barely wide enough for one. Her headlights hit the entrance, and the light seemed to be swallowed whole by the interior. Oaif hesitated. To turn back meant an hour of reversing down a lane narrower than her car. She sighed, shifted into second gear, and rolled into the dark. Inside, the sound changed. The rain vanished, replaced by a heavy, dripping silence that echoed the hum of her engine back at her, with a metallic hiss. The air felt colder, smelling of wet limestone and something sharper, something like copper. Halfway through, the headlights flickered. "No, no, no!" she pleaded, tapping the dashboard. The beams steadied, but as they swept across the curved wall ahead, they caught a shape. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a fallen beam. It was crouched on the narrow walkway to the left of the driving lane. At first, Aif thought it was a man, perhaps a hitchhiker or a worker, but as she drew closer, the geometry of the thing began to fail her eyes. It was too long. Its limbs were like peeled willow branches, pale and impossibly jointed. It sat with its knees tucked up past its ears, its back arched in a sharp, protruding spine that scraped the ceiling of the tunnel. It wore no clothes, but its skin was a mottled, translucent gray, pulled so tight over its ribs that they looked like a row of knives. Aoif's breath hitched. She didn't brake. She couldn't. Terror had turned her leg to lead on the accelerator. As the car crept forward, the creature began to move. It didn't stand up. It unfolded. It turned its head. There was no nose, no hair. Only two milky, plate-sized eyes that reflected the car's headlights with a dull, sickening luminescence. Its mouth was a jagged horizontal slit that stretched from one side of its head to the other. As she passed it, less than 3 feet away, the creature reached out. Its hand was a nightmare of too many fingers, each ending in a needle-thin point. It didn't strike the car. It simply placed its palm against the passenger window. The glass didn't shatter. It sighed. Aoif looked to her left. Through the glass, the thing was staring directly at her. Up close, she could see the pulse in its throat, a frantic, wet thumping. It opened its mouth, and instead of a scream, a sound came out that made Aoif's ears bleed, a perfect, high-pitched mimicry of her own voice. "Nearly there," the creature hissed. Aoif screamed, flooring the pedal. The tires spun on the wet concrete, screeching. She felt the car jolt, as if something had latched onto the rear bumper. The engine roared, the hatchback fishtailing wildly as the exit of the tunnel appeared like a distant gray coin of light. She burst out into the rain, the sudden roar of the storm feeling like a sanctuary. She didn't look back. She didn't stop until she reached the bright, artificial glare of a 24-hour petrol station 10 miles away. Shaking, she climbed out of the car to breathe. She walked around to the passenger side, her legs trembling. There, on the window, was a handprint. It wasn't made of dirt or grease. The glass was etched, frosted from the inside of the pane, as if the creature's touch had been so cold it had rearranged the very atoms of the window. And underneath the wiper blade on the back window, caught in the plastic, was a single long strand of translucent gray skin. Aoif looked back toward the road. The rain continued to fall, but the darkness beyond the station lights felt different now. It felt like it was waiting for her to go back. It felt like it was still hungry. The dashboard clock glowed a cold, clinical blue, 2:14 a.m. Michael gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. The highway was a desolate ribbon of black, stretching through the skeletal remains of a pine forest. He was 3 hours into a 6-hour drive, the kind of journey where the hum of the tires begins to sound like whispering voices, and the shadows at the edge of the headlights seem to twitch with predatory intent. Up ahead, the mouth of the Blackwood Tunnel loomed, a concrete gullet carved into the base of a jagged hill. It was an old structure, the yellow sodium lights inside flickering like dying stars. Michael didn't like this tunnel. Local legend called it the Throat, a name earned by the way the acoustics trapped sound, making every engine rev sound like a strangled scream. He checked his rearview mirror. Empty. He checked the road ahead. Empty. With a heavy sigh, he accelerated. The transition from the open air to the tunnel was a physical blow. The temperature dropped and the air turned stale, smelling of damp limestone and old exhaust. The rhythm of the tires over the expansion joints was hypnotic. Michael blinked, his eyelids heavy. He reached for the radio, hoping for some static or a late-night talk show to ground him, but only white noise hissed through the speakers. Then, he saw her. She was roughly 50 yards ahead, positioned exactly in the center of the 2-lane road. Michael slammed on the brakes. The screech of his tires was deafening, amplified tenfold by the tunnel walls. His car fishtailed, the scent of burning rubber filling the cabin, before coming to a dead stop barely 20 feet from the figure. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. In the harsh, artificial glare of his high beams, a woman stood, or rather existed, in the middle of the road. She was old, her skin the color of wet parchment, draped in a tattered, floral-patterned nightgown that seemed to drift in a breeze Michael couldn't feel. Her hair was a wild silver halo of static, but she wasn't standing. Her bare, blackened feet hung 4 inches above the asphalt. She was suspended in the air, her head bowed, her chin resting on her chest. "Hey!" Michael shouted, his voice cracking. He didn't open the door. He wasn't that stupid. Do you need help?" The woman didn't move. Michael shifted into reverse, his instincts screaming at him to turn around, even if it meant driving 30 miles back to the last exit. But as he looked into his rearview mirror, his breath hitched. The entrance of the tunnel was gone. Behind him, there was only darkness, a thick, oily void that the car's reverse lights couldn't penetrate. It wasn't just dark, it was an absence of space. A wet sliding sound drew his attention back to the front. The woman had raised her head. Her eyes were not eyes. They were 2 weeping sores of milky white, devoid of pupils or iris. Her mouth began to open, stretching wider than any human jaw should allow, the corners of her lips tearing with the sound of wet silk being ripped. She didn't scream. Instead, she began to move toward him. She didn't walk. She drifted, a jagged frame-by-frame motion that defied the laws of physics. One moment she was 20 feet away, the next she was 10. Michael fumbled for the gear shift, slamming it back into drive. He had to go through her. It was the only way. He floored the gas. The engine roared, but the car didn't move. The wheels spun fruitlessly on the asphalt, which had suddenly turned soft and tacky, like half-dried blood. The woman reached the hood of the car. She placed a hand on the glass of the windshield. The glass didn't crack. It frosted. A crystalline web of ice spread from her palm, turning the world gray. She leaned in, her face inches from the glass. Michael could see the individual wrinkles on her face, like canyons in a dead landscape. She whispered something, a low, rhythmic chant that bypassed his ears and echoed directly inside his skull. "The throat is hungry, Michael. It hasn't swallowed in so long." She slammed her forehead against the windshield. The glass shattered, but the shards didn't fall inward. They hovered in the air, swirling around her like a jagged crown. Michael scrambled into the passenger seat, reaching for the door handle, but the door wouldn't budge. He looked down at the floorboards. Dark, viscous liquid was seeping up through the vents, smelling of the grave. The woman drifted through the broken windshield, her floral gown brushing against the dashboard. She was cold. so cold that Michael's breath came out in thick white plumes. She reached out with a long, spindly finger and touched his forehead. The last thing Michael felt was the sensation of falling, not down, but inward, as the tunnel lights finally went out and the silence of the throat claimed its latest meal. The next morning, state troopers found a pristine black sedan parked in the middle of the Blackwood Tunnel. The engine was off, the keys were in the ignition, and the doors were locked from the inside. The car was empty. The only thing out of place was a single withered petal from a floral-patterned dress lying on the driver's seat and the faint, lingering scent of damp limestone. The clock on the dashboard of Carl's sedan flickered 2:14 a.m. The red glow was the only warmth in the cabin, a sharp contrast to the biting October chill that seeped through the glass. Carl was tired, the kind of tired that makes the edges of the world feel soft and unreliable. He'd stayed late at the office again, chasing a promotion that felt more like a mirage with every passing month. The highway was a ribbon of black silk, empty save for the rhythmic passing of overhead lights that stropped across his vision like a metronome. He was only 20 minutes from home when he saw the entrance to the Blackwood Tunnel. It wasn't a shortcut he usually took, but the main interstate was under construction, and the detour signs had funneled him toward this concrete throat in the hillside. As he entered, the world went silent. The hum of the tires changed from a dull roar to a metallic hiss. The air felt heavier, pressurized, as if the mountain above were leaning down to listen. About halfway through the 2-mile stretch, the overhead sodium lamps began to flicker. Pop, pop, pop. One by one, they died behind him, swallowing his rearview mirror in absolute ink. Carl gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning a waxy white. Then, he saw it. It stood in the breakdown lane, perhaps 50 yards ahead. At first, Carl's mind tried to make it something mundane, a discarded tarp, a piece of construction equipment, a hitchhiker in a heavy coat. But as the high beams swept over the figure, the mundane fell away, replaced by a primal, soul-deep dread. It was tall, easily 7 feet, clad in robes so black they seemed to drink the light of his headlamps. The fabric didn't flutter in the draft of the tunnel. It hung heavy and still, like funeral shrouds soaked in oil. Where a face should have been, there was only a cavernous cowl. But it wasn't empty. 2 pinpricks of cold, blue light simmered deep within the darkness of the hood. Carl's foot hovered over the brake, but a voice in the back of his brain screamed, "Don't stop! For the love of God, do not stop!" As he drew closer, the figure didn't move. It didn't reach out. It simply watched. In its right hand, it held a staff of bleached bone, topped with a blade that looked like it had been forged from frozen moonlight. The Grim Reaper, the personification of the end, standing in a damp tunnel in the middle of nowhere. Carl passed it at 60 miles per hour. The moment he was parallel to the entity, the temperature inside the car plummeted. His breath turned to a thick mist. The radio, which had been playing lo-fi jazz, erupted into a shrieking wall of static that sounded like 1,000 voices screaming underwater. He checked the mirror. The figure was gone. Relief washed over him, brief and cold, until he looked back at the road. The exit of the tunnel was gone. The road ahead simply stretched on, the concrete walls seamless and infinite. He looked at his odometer. He had been driving for 5 minutes in a 2-mile tunnel. He should have been out long ago. Thump! The car jolted. Something had landed on the roof. Carl looked up. The metal of the roof was beginning to dent inward, as if something incredibly heavy was kneeling on top of the car. Long, skeletal fingers, tipped with obsidian claws, curled over the top of the windshield, scratching the glass. Then, slowly, the hooded head peered down from the roof, upside down, staring at Carl through the windshield. The blue eyes weren't just lights. They were windows into a void where time had died. "Carl," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the creature's mouth. It came from inside Carl's own chest. "You've been running so hard to get ahead. Don't you want to rest now?" The car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out. In the absolute darkness of the tunnel, the only thing Carl could see were those 2 blue eyes, growing larger as the creature began to reach through the glass, as if it were nothing more than water. He hadn't been driving home, he had been driving toward the end, and the Reaper had finally decided to hitch a ride.